Good day, everyone, and welcome to this International Solar Alliance Expert Training course. This particular training module focuses on net metering, which is a widespread policy used primarily to encourage rooftop or distributed solar power development. This training is part of a joint initiative from the International Solar Alliance and the Clean Energy Solutions Center. The International Solar Alliance is a network of solar resource-rich countries from around the world looking to promote and scale up the use of solar power worldwide. And the Clean Energy Solutions Center is one of the leading technical assistance and training institutions in the clean energy sector around the world. This training is part of Module 1, which is focused on policies for distributed solar, and it focuses specifically on the topic of net metering. This is a two-part series, as you can see here. The first part focuses on net metering, and part 2 focuses on net billing, which is a variation on net metering that emerged later on in the process of policy development around the world. So let's have a quick look at the overall presentation. First, we'll look at the overall learning objective. We'll have a quick analysis of the historical context so that you can understand where net metering policies come from, how they work, and where they're currently being used. We'll cover essentially the design of net metering policies, the structure, the basic principles behind net metering, in the main body of the presentation, and set the stage for part 2 on net billing. This segment also will be relevant to those of you interested in policies to support distributed solar, like the segment on net FITs, as well as the other segments on solar subsidies, as well as on the future of solar policy, where some of these themes will be revisited and discussed. And at the end, you'll have a quick knowledge check, including some multiple choice questions. So first, the key goal is to understand the rise of net metering, to understand how the policies are designed and how they've changed over time, to understand how net metering has been adapted in different jurisdictions around the world, and to understand how the rise of so-called prosumers, electricity producers and consumers, are changing the face of the electricity sector. So now, let's dive into some historical context. In most parts of the world until the 1970s, utilities had an effective monopoly on power generation. Exceptions were often made for large industrial customers like the steel sector, the auto sector, pulp and paper mills, which often had their own generation on site, partly for security of supply reasons, but also in some cases for simple cost and economic reasons. They had large power demand needs, and it made sense in many cases for them to develop their own on-site generation rather than buying their supply exclusively from the utility, as household customers, for example, do. Now, in most cases, historically, on-site power generation used to be too expensive, primarily because of economies of scale. In other words, it would not have made sense for an individual household or even a small community to have their own coal-fired plant, for example. In order to produce coal power electricity cost-effectively, it requires certain economies of scale. So you can only build plants beyond a certain size, and this was not feasible for distributed or residential or even small commercial customers. It only made sense, as we discussed briefly, for large industrial customers. Now, this has started to change with the rise of low-cost solar. Solar used to be considered among the most expensive power generation technologies when it was first developed in a pre-commercial way in the 1950s and 60s. The costs were astronomical, and it was used mostly in the space program for projects beyond out in the solar system where there was no other option for on-site, on-board power supply. But as solar has scaled worldwide as a global industry and as it's become a major part of the electricity system in a number of jurisdictions around the world, its costs have come down dramatically and have made it possible for households, businesses, small customers, so-called prosumers, to actually start cost competitively producing power on their own premises, on their own building, on their own home. And this has really been a game changer and continues and promises to be a game changer in the years ahead for the utility sector as a whole. Net metering policies first emerged in the United States in the 1980s to enable customers to connect to the grid and export their surplus generation. So it was basically a permission. The idea in the beginning wasn't really to encourage distributed generation so much as simply to allow it. So in that sense, it wasn't an incentive policy. It was really just a regulatory permission that you could connect to the grid and export your surplus. And in the beginning, it also wasn't limited solely to renewable energy technologies. In fact, other technologies were allowed to be used, other non-renewable technologies. So it's important in understanding net metering to take a step back and really look at the different cost competitiveness benchmarks that renewable energy technologies face. And this graph comes from a recent report published on behalf of the International Energy Agency's Renewable Energy Technology Deployment arm, looking at the future of renewable energy policy on a report called RE Transition. And this graph tries to capture in approximate terms the dynamics. And you can see in the orange curve here, solar PV costs crashing down in around 2010, reaching retail prices in a number of jurisdictions around the world, and continuing on to become cost competitive with the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy of new build conventional technologies, so new coal plants, new gas plants, new nuclear plants. And now increasingly we're seeing solar power even surpass the wholesale price range, or rather fall beneath the wholesale price range. Again, largely because of the rapid declines that have taken place in the solar sector. So you can see that for retail customers, the important cost range is the retail price range, because that's what they're comparing it to. They can either buy their supply from the utility, or they can develop their own generation on site. And this is what's commonly called grid parity, or sometimes called socket parity. Now, the economics aren't as simple as this, because customers have there are other barriers that hinder investment in distributed technologies like solar. And it may not always, just because it's cost competitive, that it doesn't necessarily mean that millions of customers are automatically going to start developing distributed solar. So a number of other barriers are present in the market related to access to finance, the complexity of the permitting and regulatory regimes, sometimes simply barriers to entry, the lack of a well-established competitive solar installer market, a range of different issues also around quality, the quality of the installations. Several of these factors hinder or simply even just awareness. The lack of awareness on behalf of customers may limit the uptake of solar. But this graph attempts to capture the basic competitive dynamics at play and the three key benchmarks that are at work. As we saw briefly earlier, net metering or self-consumption didn't make sense in most cases in the 1980s and 90s. And when it was first introduced in the United States in Minnesota in 1983, it experienced very little uptake. It wasn't really, again, an incentive policy. It was essentially just to allow them, if anybody wanted to, they could connect to the grid. But again, this started to change as solar and other renewable energy costs have declined. And now a growing number of net metering policies are specifically focused on renewable energy technologies. So many of them no longer allow conventional technologies to participate, or there are separate programs, separate policies for larger fossil fuel or non-renewable technologies to sell their excess generation. But net metering increasingly and overwhelmingly focuses on renewable energy technologies. And this is really, as solar has gotten cheaper and cheaper, net metering has emerged actually as one of the, as a focal point of both political and customer interest in renewable energy policy, because it really is at the cross section between where customers, the average citizens, average ratepayers, and the utility are. And net metering policies in that sense are one of the main tools, one of the main policy mechanisms governing that overall relationship between customers who used to buy their power from a monopoly utility and that utility itself. And we're seeing a complete redefinition of that traditional relationship as solar has gotten cheaper and cheaper. And now we're seeing new business models emerging that are allowing people to trade power with one another. So households and small businesses can trade power with one another rather than selling it to the utility directly. And some of these innovations are covered in another module, or a set of modules focused either on solar business models or on the rise of what's called peer-to-peer power sharing in the electricity sector. So if you're interested in these topics, I encourage you to have a quick look and listen in on those training sessions as well. Now that we've set the stage with a bit of history, a bit of context, let's dive in and look at net metering policies themselves and how they're designed. Net metering effectively allows individuals or businesses with customer-sided generation to connect to the grid and be credited for the excess power they feed into the system. Now, the key point here is that in most cases, the meter rolls backwards. There's no separate compensation mechanism. It's just, if you're in a net consumption position, your meter is rolling as it traditionally does. But if you're producing more power than you're consuming, the meter actually rolls forward and will inject power back into the grid. So it effectively erases your bill on a one-to-one basis. So a kilowatt hour consumed versus a kilowatt hour injected to the grid on a one-to-one basis. Bill credits in this sense are typically granted in kilowatt hours. So on your bill, you will see how many kilowatt hours you consume from the utility net, and you'll see how many kilowatt hours you injected into the grid. And you can, if you have excess kilowatt hours at the end of the month, you can typically bank those and carry them over. And we'll get into some of the dynamics around that in a moment. So the basic formula is that the compensation rate equals the retail rate. A key point here is that traditional net metering, as we're covering it here, does not result in a cash payment. There is no transfer of money. The utility is not paying you for your generation. It is simply compensating you at the retail rate. It credits that customer generation at a rate that's equivalent to the rate that you're paying. So in other words, whatever incentive you have to develop solar under net metering is primarily, unless there are significant tax incentives or other policies, is primarily based on savings on your power bill. Because again, you're not getting a check at the end of the month, you're just getting a reduced power bill. This diagram provides a snapshot of the basic mechanics of net energy metering. You can see here the basic dynamics, how the power supply system, the panels on the roof, flow in through the meter, typically now a bidirectional meter. There were net metering policies in the past that used to use 2 meters. Now most of them predominantly use bidirectional meters and allow the netting to occur in real time and the calculation to be done then based on the billing cycle. Now, an interesting feature of net metering, and one of the reasons that some customers, particularly in jurisdictions with rapid electricity demand growth, find net metering policies attractive is not necessarily because of the current retail rate. It's because of their expectations with regard to future electricity retail rates. So if you're in a jurisdiction where power rates are going up 5% per year and show no signs of slowing down, your incentive to invest in customer-sited generation and protect yourself against those rate increases grows significantly, because the value of your self-consumption actually increases over time as retail prices increase. And that's essentially what's shown here in this quick diagram. The basic logic there is, if you're in a jurisdiction with fairly rapid electricity price increases, developing customer-sited generation can make significant economic sense, even if your current retail rate is quite low, because future rates are ultimately what's going to determine the majority of the value, the cost savings of your solar installation. Now, over 60 countries around the world have adopted some form of net metering. So it's increasingly a widely used policy tool. In some regions, residential solar, governed primarily by net metering, surpasses 200% of maximum daytime load. You can see that in some feeders in places like Hawaii and even in parts of southern Germany, there is more power supply from solar on the wires than there is demand. So the power flows essentially upstream onto higher voltage lines, because there's just not enough demand within the local network, within the local feeder, to use up all of those kilowatt hours. So this is this indicates a significant shift in the power market, and has been driven, at least in jurisdictions like Hawaii, by policies like net metering. And in Germany, it's been driven more by feed-in tariffs, where we have currently an estimated 1.65 million individual solar PV systems. And in jurisdictions like Queensland, Australia, over 30% of households now have a solar PV system. And Australia is an interesting case in that they were one of the first jurisdictions around the world to adopt what's called a net fit policy. So in a way, a hybrid between a net metering policy and a feed-in tariff, which is also covered in a separate training module in this ISA training series. In Queensland, a remarkable development has happened in recent years as solar has gotten increasingly cheap, as it has elsewhere around the world, but also as power rates were going up and up and up, and customer awareness is quite high, and also disposable income is quite high, and we've seen a fairly dynamic evolution of the market there in the last couple of years. And Australia has really emerged as one of the most interesting jurisdictions for innovation and policy change and regulatory innovation in this space. And as I pointed out earlier, such a large shift in the uptake of distributed generation signals a fundamental shift in the power industry. Net metering is commonly used for rooftop solar PV projects, so typically under 1 megawatt. But it can also be used for larger scale projects from 1 to 10, as well as for other technologies. In most cases, net metering policies require connection at the distribution level, although there are some exceptions in some cases where self-consumption projects are allowed to connect at the transmission or at higher voltage, medium voltage lines, for example. Now, with regard to the billing and the customer compensation side of things, which is really the heart of most net metering policies. Most net metering policies enable the customer to bank their excess generation up to 12 months. So in other words, if you have a very sunny July, you can carry over your net excess credits, your kilowatt hour credits, and use them to erase credits in the following series of months. Some jurisdictions have a completely unlimited banking policy, so you can continue to bank your excess credits indefinitely into the future, gathering in some cases hundreds, if not thousands, of extra kilowatt hours on your account that you can then use down and draw down in future months and years. Most policies or most jurisdictions limit this to a 12-month period. So at the end of 12 months, what's called the settlement period, the net excess generation credits are then forfeited, typically under net metering at no, without a payment, essentially, to the customer. So if you're in a net excess position, then you essentially lose your net excess credits at the end of the year. Now, obviously, some people in the solar industry think that this is unfair and that the customer should be compensated for that net excess generation. But the primary goal of net metering policies, and the argument that utilities will often make, is that the aim here is to encourage right sizing. In other words, the goal of net metering is to encourage customers to offset their own consumption, not to become major producers of excess generation on the distribution system. So by refusing to pay for the net excess generation at the end of the year, or settling it at some rate, as is done under net billing or under net fits, net metering simply results in that excess generation being lost and given, essentially forfeited to the utility. This graph here shows a quick profile of what this looks like on a standard residential household. You can see here during the evening hours, consumption from the grid. During the daytime, rising self-consumption supplied by on-site solar. The gray line represents production of the PV units, and then the excess generation from the daytime power offsets then the electricity consumption in the evening hours. This is a basic profile. We'll see more examples of this in a few slides. A key feature here is the rollover period, which refers to the time period over which the net excess generation credits are calculated. It's usually connected to the billing cycle, which in most cases is 1 month. In some jurisdictions, it's every 2 months. But essentially, this is when the actual net meter is calculated and is looked at. So it's typically related to the meter reading. Different rollover periods have a fundamental impact on the attractiveness of investing in a distributed generation project or a solar PV project, for instance. In some cases, the rollover period is very short, and this means that you can only offset kilowatt hours, let's say within a daily or in some cases even an hourly basis. So if you have net excess generation at the end of the hour, then it gets rolled over, versus on a daily, yearly, or even in most cases monthly way. And you can see here that the mechanism of this for a customer has a fundamental impact on how attractive it is to invest in solar. Because if you're on an hourly compensation rollover period, that means that you need to be, if you produce more power in the first half hour of the hour, you need to use that up already within the following half hour. Otherwise, those credits will get rolled over. So it can be it can have a very significant impact on the overall financials, the overall economics of investing in solar, if you can't carry that consumption over a longer period of time. The settlement period is related to this, and it refers to the time at which the net excess generations are settled from a financial standpoint. And this is typically at the end of 12 months. The main options for dealing with this are listed here. So under option A, excess generation is forfeited. This is what we saw earlier, and this is classic net metering. Under option B, these excess credits can be credited at some specific separate rate. And this is what is often called net billing. So it won't be a cash payment under net billing in most cases. It's simply a bill credit but it is credited at some rate that is not the retail rate. And you can then carry that over into the subsequent year. Under C, excess generation is remunerated at some rate and actually paid for. So this results in a cash payment. And that is the third variation here, is what's called a net fit, where you can offset your own consumption on site with your own supply. And if you have net supply, net excess generation, the utility will buy it from you at some set rate, which is the net fit rate in this case. This table provides a quick overview of some of the key design features. Although much of net metering focuses on the compensation mechanism and the actual billing provisions around, as I mentioned, the settlement period and the rollover provisions, there are a number of other key features. For example, time of use tariffs. In some cases, customers may be on time of use tariffs, and that can make net metering even more attractive if the time of use is during the daytime. Project size caps, program size caps. There's also a range of fixed charges that utilities sometimes impose on net metering customers. All of those different factors, including permitting fees, applications, etc., grid interconnection rules, all of those factors can significantly impact the overall attractiveness of investing in solar. So net metering is not just a simple policy that allows the netting of excess generation. It involves a foundation of different policy instruments and policy and regulatory provisions that are, some of which are listed here. So although the key is really focused on the compensation mechanism, in order to make a net metering policy work, it requires all these other, or at least many of these other components as well. You can see here a quick map of the US showing the different net metering policies and the different designs for compensating net excess generation. That's the NEG in the graph. The US, as the home of net metering, remains the country with the widest variety of net metering policies of any country in the world. It is a real patchwork of different mechanisms, compensation structures, rules, treatment of renewable energy certificates. There are hundreds of nuances in different state level policies across the US, and even sub-state level policies. The different utilities implement different net metering policies from other utilities in the same state. So it's a very complex policy and regulatory landscape for net metering. But you can see here that in some states, net excess generation is credited at the full retail rate and credits do not expire. You can see here under the slightly more pale blue, slightly less dark blue ones that it's credited at the retail rate first, and then it can be compensated at the avoided cost rate for the rest. So this would be kind of like net billing. And the middle one here, net on the right, or the top one on the right, is where it's compensated at the less than the retail rate. Or, for example, the avoided cost rate. So under this particular approach, this would be called net billing. And there are a number of states, again, where there is no standard net metering rules yet for statewide policies, and you can see those in white. There are also states that don't offer any compensation for net excess generation. So you can really see here that this is it's a very, very diverse regulatory landscape. This is a quick snapshot of some of the policies in Europe, dating back from a few years ago. Some of this has changed a little bit, but it gives you an idea of some of the diversity within Europe as well. And this table provides an overview of net metering policies around the world. Again, this list is not exhaustive, but it captures the key countries, key jurisdictions around the world. You can see here A quick graph showing the uptake of residential solar PV across the EU. From fairly modest beginnings, it has grown now to over 30,000 megawatts of residential solar PV capacity, the majority of which is based in Germany. Not all of this capacity is driven by net metering, as we discussed earlier. Much of it was driven by feed-in tariffs, but you can see here that residential solar PV is becoming a major new source of power generation, and in a growing number of jurisdictions, as feed-in tariffs are being scaled back, net metering is starting to become a much more important policy mechanism in governing the rise of distributed solar. Now, if we look at some profiles, some load profiles, it's helpful to get a sense of how this actually works in practice. So this shows in gray the actual electricity demand of an office building, a small office. And you can see here the Monday to Friday, essentially, the 5 peaks, and then a much lower power demand on Saturday and then Sunday. And spread against that, or lined up against that, is a standard profile of solar PV output. And you can see here, essentially, the basic relationship. The blue line then shows the net grid injection. So what's remarkable here is that the only time with this customer where there's net grid injection is on the weekend and predominantly on Sundays. So the only time that this customer would have or would be generating excess credits is really on the weekend. A similar dynamic plays out here with the supermarket, but you can see, for instance, the supermarket has a much larger load. So we're talking here in the several hundreds of kilowatts. They have a 250 kilowatt solar PV unit, or I think this is modeled at potentially 280. You can see here the basic relationship between the PV output and the overall net grid injection. A supermarket has a much more consistent load profile. So there's electricity demand fairly stably across all 7 days of the week, with a slight dip on Sundays. But because of refrigeration and basic lighting and security systems and all the rest, the supermarket will have fairly stable demand through the week, which makes them an ideal customer for developing on-site solar power. And that's why we're seeing a growing number of customers, a growing number of supermarkets around the world starting to look at this very seriously and starting to invest on this. They have the available roof space. They are typically there for on either long leases or for a long period of time, and in many cases own the building. And they have a very favorable load profile. So in this case, this supermarket wouldn't even need a net metering policy because they can fully self-consume all of their power. This would change, however, if they installed a slightly larger solar PV unit. So if they decided to dimension their PV system upward to, say, 400 kilowatts, then you would have much more significant net excess generation during many days of the week. And that would then make net metering more attractive. In the absence, this is a really key point, in the absence of a regulatory framework like net metering, many customers will do exactly what this supermarket here is doing. They will dimension their system so that they don't have any net excess generation, or very little net excess generation. And that may or may not be what the utility wants. It may or may not be what's best for society or for ratepayers at large. There's a number of trade-offs here, and the the basic logic of net metering is to try to capture those customers and try to get them to, if they want to inject net excess generation into the grid and contribute clean power to the system, that they should be able to do so, and shouldn't be scared of slightly over-dimensioning their system. Now, when you take a step back and you look at this over the entire power system, You can see what this looks like roughly on a profile of a standard day. So the basic logic there is the power demand peaks in the evening and in the early morning hours, and PV essentially layers on top. And as the share of solar grows, obviously this gets a lot spikier, and you'll see that the overall profile and the impact on the power system is significantly different as the share of solar power grows. This will be covered in another training module looking at the future of solar policy. So some key advantages of net metering. First, it allows customers to develop on-site generation, connect to the grid, and export their net excess supply. The compensation formula is very simple. It's simply the retail rate. Most customers know the retail rate, or at least have a sense of what the retail rate is. So the compensation formula is very simple and very easy to understand. It's also, in most cases, typically easy to participate. And as PV costs continue to decline, it's making net metering increasingly attractive. As we saw in the beginning, in the 1980s and 90s, net metering was not a very attractive policy option. And we saw very little uptake. This is starting to change again as PV gets cheaper and cheaper. Customers can effectively use the grid as a battery, they export their surplus, and it avoids the need to invest in on-site storage. So they can still go solar without needing to buy a storage kit and all the rest. And a further advantage is that net metering can be combined easily with new business models. And we're seeing a number of new business models actually being built on the back of net metering policies, like solar leasing, virtual net metering, and community solar. So we're seeing quite a bit of innovation in those, and I encourage you to look at the training specifically on new business models to get a better sense of how rapidly that landscape in particular is changing. Now, some of the challenges of net metering. It's typically limited to small and medium project sizes, so under 2 megawatts, which arguably artificially limits the project size of the customer. In some jurisdictions, for example, a customer may have 5 or 6 megawatts of land or of rooftop space for a large factory that they want to use. But if the net metering policy is capped at 1 or 2 megawatts, they won't be able to make full and complete use of their available land and or roof space. So arguably net metering is in some jurisdictions too restrictive, and the caps are often too small. The compensation rate is arguably arbitrary because the retail rate itself has no relationship to the actual cost of investing in solar. So a further issue with the compensation rate being arbitrary is that a residential customer has a certain rate, a commercial customer has a different rate, and an industrial customer will have a yet different rate. And in many jurisdictions, there are multiple different variations, even within those different broad categories of residential, commercial, and industrial. Moreover, there are also inclining block rates, where you pay more the more power you consume. So the first block of power is cheaper, the second block is a bit more, and the third block is charged or billed at the highest rate. So when you combine net metering with more complex rate structures, it gets arguably fairly arbitrary which customers are getting the best payback versus others. So the rate structure, the rate design, and the fact that different customers have different rate structures themselves makes it a fairly arbitrary way to determine the actual value of customer-sited or distributed generation to the grid or to the utility or to society. So there's a push in many jurisdictions away from net metering and towards either various forms of net billing, or in some cases even value of solar tariffs, where they try to conduct analyses looking specifically at what the value of that net excess generation is and setting the compensation rate on the basis of that, instead of the actual retail rate that the customer pays. And that arguably could reduce the discrimination between different customer classes. One of the big issues, for example, in the beginning with net metering was that industrial customers and commercial customers in at least North America were disadvantaged because they often paid lower rates than retail customers did. So if industrial customers had rates of, say, 5 cents per kilowatt hour, the economics were even worse, even though industrial customers may have been the ones best positioned to invest in customer-sited solar. So again, this connection to the retail rate is coming under increasing scrutiny and is increasingly seen as arbitrary. On the flip side, this type of policy using net metering favors larger electricity customers. As we saw a moment ago, if you have a inclining block rate bill structure, the more you consume, the higher your power rate. And that means that the blocks of power that you're erasing are often the ones that are the most valuable to the utility, but they're also the ones that the wealthiest customers have a greatest incentive. The larger households, for example, have a larger incentive to erase. So it makes it even more attractive for the wealthier, larger households, larger consumers to invest in solar, while making it very difficult or unattractive economically for low-income households or smaller households, for example, who are not paying the top retail rate. So there's arguably equity and fairness issues in the inherent in the policy design there. As we saw a moment ago, higher value is therefore awarded to certain customers than others. So if their residential rate is, let's just say, for instance, higher or lower than commercial rate, there's a different value being awarded, even if they're essentially both producing solar power and both injecting their kilowatt hours into a similar neighborhood grid. So that is a further issue connected to the previous point. Another issue here for utilities is that the value of net excess generation and banked credits goes up over time as electricity prices increase. But the value of solar to the grid may in fact decline as the share of solar grows. So there's a bit of a disconnect. Why would the value of solar decline? Well, on the one hand, solar is becoming cheaper and cheaper, so then every new solar system coming online is arguably more cost effective than the last. But a more important factor here is that as the share of daytime solar power grows, it's a classic supply and demand situation where there's a surplus of supply and therefore prices crash. So if there's too much daytime solar on the grid because there are too many, or there's a significant volume of solar power on a sunny day being injected into the grid, the actual marginal value of each kilowatt hour solar declines. And that's why we've seen even negative electricity market prices in jurisdictions like Germany and Austria, because there's in part connected to the fact that there's a surplus of generation on the system and not enough demand, or at least not enough flexibility of demand to take up those kilowatt hours when they're available. So that's another disconnect that's worth highlighting. And finally, in island regions with high retail tariffs, like Hawaii and the Caribbean or in many Pacific islands, compensation at the full retail rate, as is done under classic net metering, may result in overcompensation. And that's been one of the arguments, again, driving the rise of policies like net billing. A further set of concerns relates to cross-subsidies and utility cost recovery. A growing number of states in the US and in other jurisdictions around the world are having battles over the cost of solar, cost sharing, social equity issues, and cross-subsidy issues between different customers, between solar customers and non-solar customers. And that debate continues to rage on. It really depends on the fundamentals of the rate structure. It depends on the composition of the electricity market. it also depends on the overall socioeconomic background in which solar power is being, residential solar power, for instance, is being developed. But those issues are, in many cases, real, and the concerns and the tensions are starting to grow. There's also a number of issues around tax treatment and the treatment of fixed bill charges, whether you can erase your bill charges or not, whether you can erase the fixed components of your power bill or not with net excess generation. And concerns around net metering being less bankable than, say, for example, a net fit, or even more directly, a full feed-in tariff. Because net metering does not allow a cash payment, from a bank's perspective, it's often not considered a bankable investment because there's no cash flow in the classic sense. It's all based on bill savings. And in order for the bank to take those bill savings seriously, they need to have some degree of confidence that you're going to be in that building or in that site or a rate-paying customer for the foreseeable future, for the next 10, if not 15 or 20 years. And that makes it quite difficult. In many cases also, customers will change locations, will move. So there's a number of issues around moving your solar system, or or leaving the solar system on the house if you want to sell your house, or if you want to rent it to someone else. All of those issues make the net metering policy and the provisions around moving quite critical. And in many states, they've had to elaborate policies specifically and guidance specifically to clarify these different cases. And a further issue is that power system subsidies continue to keep retail rates artificially low in many jurisdictions around the world, which makes customer-sided generation less attractive. So if the power system as a whole is heavily subsidized, it likely won't make sense for customers, at least most customers, to invest in distributed solar. So that's remains a concern around net metering in some jurisdictions. That even as solar has gotten cheaper and cheaper, power system subsidies continue to distort the investment landscape. Now, some key questions on some key decision points that need to be made with regard to a net metering policy. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but this provides a quick snapshot of some of the key decisions. Does the same rate apply both to self-consumption and to exported generation? Which technologies are eligible? Which customer types are eligible? What are the project sizes that are allowed? Is there a cap on the total amount of capacity allowed? How long is the net metering agreement? Another tricky one, number 7, is, do existing projects qualify? So can projects be grandfathered into the net metering policy? And are there additional charges or fees for participating in net metering? And are certain bill components ring-fenced, so non-erasable through self-consumption? And all of these things, again, different jurisdictions answer these questions differently and approach this differently. This just gives you a sense of some of the key decision points that net metering policymakers need to grapple with in designing a balanced policy framework. Now, let's take a quick look at the future of net metering. As we've seen and as we've discussed, the cost of solar PV has and continues to decline. And you can see here across different customer classes, this is based on US data from a recent NREL report. You can see across residential, commercial, utility scale, and larger utility scale projects, there are dramatic cost declines. Now on utility scale projects, we are well below $1 a watt installed. And in some jurisdictions internationally, well below. So not even just incrementally below, but there are other jurisdictions installing systems even below US or well below US installed costs. And residential systems are also being installed for somewhere in the dollar a watt range, including all cost components. So this is this graph really gives you a sense of quite just how dramatic the decline is and has been in recent years. And there are a few signs of this coming to an end. Although growth or the rate of decline is starting to arguably to asymptotically slow down, the basic trend continues to remain downward, and PV is becoming increasingly cost effective as modules become more efficient, as the market grows and installers don't need to earn as much on each individual solar system, as people get better at controlling, as companies get better at controlling their soft costs and their installation costs, and technologies like inverters are also coming down in cost as well, which makes the overall equation even more attractive for net metering customers. So this is a real, this underscores why policies like net metering remain so important and such a key part of the landscape, because it's becoming a very economic option for power supply for a growing number of customers around the world, and not just in the US or in Canada or in Europe, but also in jurisdictions like the Philippines, South Africa, China, and India. You can see that solar is already well below the retail rate in many jurisdictions around the world. This table provides a quick snapshot of some jurisdictions: Germany, Hawaii, Australia, New York State in the US, and Cabo Verde off the coast of West Africa. And you can see here the basic relationship. And you can see that PV is already significantly cheaper than the retail rate in these jurisdictions. So the economics are there. Now, as solar has gotten increasingly cost competitive, as we've seen, net metering policies have started to evolve, and they've evolved into a range of alternatives. Net billing, which is going to be covered in part 2 of this session, net fits, and we've also seen the rise of buy all, sell all policies, which is also sometimes called simply feed-in tariffs, where there's an obligation to buy all of your power from the utility, and if you're a producer, to sell all of your power to the utility, essentially forbidding self-consumption. So nobody can self-consume their own power supply. You have to continue buying all of your supply from the utility. But those policies give you the right to also become a generator. So this would be the difference between a customer generator and a prosumer. And you can see here in a different depiction the basic relationship between these different policies: first generation, second generation, and third generation net metering. So the first one we've seen, net billing, is where the net excess generation starts to be compensated at below the retail rate. And the third generation is where there's the introduction of a cash payment for that net excess generation. And the overall logic shifts, where distributed solar is no longer seen just as demand reduction, but is also seen as a potential new and potentially major source of new power supply. And we've seen some jurisdictions shift in that direction in recent years, and we'll look at that more closely in session 7, specifically on net fits. So there are some trends emerging that can be quickly flagged and quickly highlighted before we wrap this particular session up. There's a trend towards the compensation rate being set below the retail rate, or at a rate that is separate from the retail rate. There's a movement towards offering a cash payment or a cash settlement for the net excess generation. There's also a spread towards using time of use rates, or allowing customers who have time of use to also get time of use credits for their net metering, for their net excess generation. There are also some jurisdictions exploring location-specific compensation rates for net excess generation, this in particular in California. Ring fencing is becoming more common, making certain components of the bill non-bypassable or non-erasable. There's a differentiation of the overall policy design for different project size categories. So we're seeing, for example, differences between net metering, net billing, net fits, and embedded generation policies for larger embedded generation size projects, say between 5 and 25 megawatts. Different policies are being adapted to capture the full spectrum of different project sizes. And we're also seeing the use of technologies like blockchain and peer-to-peer power sharing, as well as new business models like solar leasing and community solar starting to jump on the bandwagon and starting to be applied to distributed solar. And we're starting to see a growing number of customers opting for those and using net metering in a way as an enabling, in a sense, net metering can be understood as an enabling policy of many of these other innovations taking place in the sector. Now, why is net metering becoming less appropriate? Why are we seeing this shift, this evolution away from net metering? Net metering, arguably, as we've seen, overcompensates certain customer owners, solar PV system owners. It tends to erode revenue from the highest or most profitable customers first. As we've seen, the retail rate is often considered to be arbitrary and having no relation to the cost of solar or to the value of solar. And it raises customer cross-subsidization issues, all of which, again, these debates have emerged in just about every jurisdiction that has a net metering policy, and the debate rages on. So now a few concluding remarks before we wrap up. According to many analysts in the sector, the genie is effectively out of the bottle. There's little that we can do to put that genie back in. And what policymakers and regulators need to do and utilities need to do is get smart about how to create sustainable, long-term regulatory and policy conditions governing the rise of distributed solar. And net metering was the first such policy out of the gate, so to speak, that really tried to address this residential and commercial self-consumption market, but it's definitely not the last. And we've seen a number of innovations, a number of changes, and this indicates, on the one hand, the need for vigilance and the need for being adaptive and keeping the policy frameworks well adapted to the overall economic and business model changes that are taking place. But it also signals that we are rapidly moving towards a very different and in many cases more decentralized power system architecture than the one we've all grown up with. And I think that's where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, a tremendous amount of excitement about this space. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing so much interest in policies like net metering, like net fits, and net billing around the world to try to find, as we try to find better ways of governing this evolution. As I underscore here at the end of the slides, this is poised to become one of the key challenges in the years ahead. So now a quick look at some further reading. A few key citations here and reports. All the links are there. There have also been some links throughout the presentation. And I invite you, as I said, to take a look at some of the other training series in this International Solar Alliance set of training modules. And I'll now wrap up and guide you to the knowledge checkpoint, where you'll have a few quick multiple choice questions assessing your knowledge and your understanding of the key components of the module. So this is Toby Couture from E3 Analytics, wrapping up the training module on net metering. And I look forward to being with you again for future trainings on other segments in this International Solar Alliance training series. Thank you very much, and wishing you all a great day.